They never warn you that getting closer to God can feel like losing your footing. No one tells you that spiritual growth can feel like disorientation, that it can feel like grief, that it can feel like something inside you is quietly breaking apart, not because something is wrong, but because something old is finally dying. Most people assume that walking with God feels like confidence, peace, clarity, and certainty. They expect light, clarity, emotional highs. They expect answers. But what they often experience instead is discomfort, questions, silence, a strange heaviness mixed with an even stranger peace they can't explain. And that's when doubt creeps in. You start wondering if you're drifting, if you're doing something wrong, if you've somehow lost your connection to God. But what if the opposite is true? What if the confusion you feel is not distance, but closeness? What if the discomfort is not punishment, but pruning? What if the uncertainty is not absence, but invitation? Because the truth most people aren't told is this: growing closer to God often feels like losing control, not gaining it. It feels like becoming more aware of your flaws instead of your strengths. It feels like your certainties dissolving instead of solidifying. It feels like standing in the dark with nothing but a quiet knowing that you're being led somewhere you can't yet see. And that is deeply unsettling, especially for those who were taught that faith should make life simpler, cleaner, easier to explain. But intimacy with God does not work like that. Intimacy exposes before it heals. It unsettles before it anchors. It humbles before it strengthens. If you're listening to this and something you feel seen, uneasy, or strangely comforted at the same time, that's not coincidence. That's recognition. Something in you knows this terrain. And here's the first truth you need to hear, even if it unsettles you. Growing closer to God rarely feels like spiritual success. It often feels like spiritual vulnerability. One of the earliest signs that someone is drawing closer to God is not moral perfection, but heightened awareness. You begin to notice things you once ignored. Thoughts you once excused now linger uncomfortably. Habits you once defended now trouble your spirit. You start feeling conviction where there used to be indifference. And this can be terrifying if you misunderstand it. You may think you're getting worse, when in reality, you're becoming more awake. When you are far from God, sin feels small. It blends into the background. You rationalize it. You compare yourself to others. You tell yourself it's not that bad. But when you draw near to God, light increases. And light reveals dust you didn't know was there. This isn't condemnation. It's clarity. The closer you stand to something holy, the more clearly you see what doesn't belong. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means your conscience is being sharpened. Your sensitivity is returning. Your heart is waking up. Dead hearts don't ache. Numb hearts don't grieve their own patterns. Only living hearts do. You start noticing impatience that once felt normal. You catch pride in your thoughts before it hardens into action. You feel a check in your spirit over things you once laughed off. And suddenly you wonder, why am I struggling more now than before? But the struggle isn't decline. It's refinement. When Isaiah encountered God's holiness, he didn't feel accomplished. He felt undone. When Peter realized who Jesus truly was, his response wasn't pride, it was humility. Nearness to God doesn't inflate the ego. It dissolves it. If you feel more aware of your flaws lately, it may be because God is close enough to show them to you safely. Another quiet sign of spiritual growth is the shifting of desire, not in dramatic ways at first, but in subtle ones that are easy to miss. You may find that things you once craved don't satisfy you the same way. Distractions feel hollow. Conversations that once energized you now feel empty. Old habits lose their thrill, not because they've suddenly become sinful in appearance, but because they no longer feed you. At the same time, things that once felt boring or uncomfortable begin to draw you in. Silence, scripture, stillness, truth, prayer. You may not even enjoy them at first, but something keeps pulling you back. This tension can be confusing. You're not fully attached to who you were, but you're not fully comfortable with who you're becoming. You feel like you're standing between worlds. That's not backsliding. That's transition. God rarely rips things away all at once. More often, he loosens your grip. He allows desires to fade instead of explode. He lets satisfaction drain slowly, so you can recognize that it no longer nourishes you, and that can feel like grief. You might miss parts of your old self. You might miss how easy things felt. You might even resent the discomfort. But what's happening is not loss. It's realignment. You're learning to hunger for what sustains instead of what distracts. Another sign you're growing closer to God is that your prayers begin to change. They become less impressive and more honest. You stop trying to sound spiritual. You stop performing. You stop editing your emotions before you speak. Sometimes you don't even know what to say at all. You just sit there, quiet, unsure, maybe even frustrated. And strangely, that's when prayer becomes real. You begin to realize that God was never impressed by eloquence. He was never fooled by polished language. He was never distant because your words weren't right. He wanted your truth. So you stop pretending you're okay when you're not. You stop forcing gratitude when you feel grief. You stop masking doubt with religious phrases. You tell God when you're angry. You tell him when you're confused. You tell him when you don't understand why he's silent. And instead of pulling away, you feel closer. That's because honesty is intimacy. Pretending creates distance. Authenticity creates connection. When prayer becomes less about sounding faithful and more about being real, you're not losing reverence. You're deepening trust. Another shift begins quietly. Your relationship with approval changes. There was a time when affirmation mattered deeply, when being seen, praised, or validated gave you energy. You measured progress by how others responded to you. You felt good when people noticed your faith, your growth, your goodness. But somewhere along the way, that hunger weakens. You still appreciate encouragement, but you don't depend on it. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop craving applause for obedience. You start caring more about whether your actions align with God than whether they're understood by people. This can feel lonely at first. You might notice that fewer people get you. You might find yourself misunderstood or even questioned. But instead of panicking, something inside you settles. You feel anchored in a way you didn't before. That's because your reference point has shifted. You're no longer measuring your life horizontally against others. You're measuring it vertically against truth. And that changes everything. Obedience starts to matter more than image. Integrity becomes more important than influence. And sometimes that means choosing paths that don't look impressive, don't earn applause, and don't make sense to anyone watching. That's not loss. That's alignment. Another sign of spiritual growth is discomfort with compromise. Things you once brushed off now trouble you. You feel unsettled in environments that used to feel neutral. Conversations that once felt harmless now leave you drained. Choices you once justified now feel heavy. This isn't self-righteousness. It's sensitivity. As you grow closer to God, your inner compass sharpens. You begin to sense when something pulls you away from peace, even if it looks acceptable on the surface. You feel the difference between freedom and permission, between kindness and avoidance, between love and enabling. And this awareness can be inconvenient because it forces you to make choices, to set boundaries, to walk away from things that once felt normal. Sometimes it even costs you relationships. But what you gain is clarity. You begin to understand that holiness isn't about restriction. It's about protection. It's not about rules. It's about alignment. It's not about being better than others. It's about being truer to who you're becoming. Another quiet shift happens in how you experience waiting. There was a time when waiting felt unbearable. Silence felt like abandonment. Delays felt like rejection. You needed answers. You needed movement. You needed reassurance. But slowly, something changes. You still desire clarity, but you're no longer frantic. You still hope for breakthrough, but you're not panicking in the absence of it. You begin to trust that timing has purpose, even when you don't understand it. Waiting becomes less about inactivity and more about trust. You stop trying to force doors open. You stop manufacturing outcomes. You stop equating speed with favor. You begin to believe that if God is silent, it's not because he's absent, but because he's working beneath the surface. This kind of patience doesn't come from discipline. It comes from relationship. It comes from knowing the character of the one you're waiting on. Another sign you're growing closer to God is that your compassion deepens, but your boundaries strengthen. You feel more empathy, not less. You hurt more easily for others. You feel their pain. You care deeply. But you also stop rescuing everyone. You stop absorbing damage just to prove love. You learn that love does not require self-betrayal. You begin to understand that Jesus healed many, but not all. He loved everyone, but not everyone had access to him. He withdrew to pray. He said no. He disappointed people, and he did it without guilt. You learn that compassion without discernment leads to burnout. That love without boundaries becomes enabling. That saying no could be an act of faith. You stop confusing responsibility with control. And perhaps the deepest sign of all is this. You continue choosing God even when it costs you, when obedience no longer comes with reward, when faith doesn't feel exciting, when prayers go unanswered, when doors remain closed, when following God feels heavy instead of hopeful. You still choose him, not because you're afraid, not because you expect something in return, but because somewhere along the way, your relationship with God stopped being transactional. You stopped asking, "What will I get?" and started asking, "Who am I becoming?" You choose faith when it's quiet. You choose integrity when it's inconvenient. You choose trust when understanding is unavailable. That's not weakness. That's depth, and few ever reach it. If you're still here, still seeking, still wrestling, still longing for truth, you are not behind. You are not failing. You are not lost. You are being formed. Growth doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, through changed desires, softened reactions, deeper convictions, and quieter strength. So if you feel unsettled, stretched, or stripped back in this season, don't rush to escape it. Ask what it's shaping. Because sometimes the clearest sign that you're growing closer to God is that you can no longer pretend you're the same person you used to be. And here's the question that lingers after all of this, the one only you can answer. If this discomfort is actually transformation, what might God be preparing you for next?